Welcome back to Inside Update, where every other week we are unpacking the newest investigations and news from Inside Investigator. Today I am joined by Mark E. Fitch and Brandon Whiting, authors of the most recent long-form works available at insideinvestigator.org. We are going to first talk about another investigation into the Connecticut Department of Children and Families. This time, the way that reporting works or doesn't work when dealing with newborn babies who are potentially at risk. That's going to be Mark's. And then we're going to chat with Brandon about a missing persons case that he explored, specifically about the impact on the individual's family, even now, 30 years on. Mark, let's start with you. This investigation, it's called High Risk Newborn. I love the visuals. I recommend that people go look at it, but the writing was fantastic. Tell us what that was like.
Well, sure. This was actually kind of a difficult piece to parse out because it deals with a lot of nuanced language, as and a lot of things that are kind of contrary to common sense when it comes to whether a newborn baby should be reported to DCF for them to intervene. There's some interesting laws and language surrounding this. What it comes down to is that the federal government implemented a program. It's called CAPTA, CAPTA. And basically, what it requires is that any child born at the federal level affected by drugs or alcohol, the doctor has to notify Child Protective Services through this online portal. It's really a data gathering system. It was implemented to try to measure the extent of the opioid crisis and how it was affecting newborns. In Connecticut, though, we did it a little differently. For one thing, we de-identified the information in the CAPTA notification. So just because a doctor notifies the state system through CAPTA, it doesn't necessarily mean there's going to be a DCF investigation into that mother. What CAPTA does ask is whether or not the doctor or medical staff have any other concerns about the mother and her ability to parent. At that point, it can become a DCF investigation. It sends them to a different portal. DCF takes in that information and decides what they're going to do with it. So and the other thing that we did differently in Connecticut, aside of kind of keeping the notifications anonymous, is that we notify the state system for any child who has been exposed to drugs or alcohol during the entire course of the pregnancy. So, any parents out there, maybe you had a glass of wine or two during your pregnancy. That would actually technically be grounds for getting a CAPTA notification. And when the child's born, the state would be notified that they had been exposed to drugs or alcohol. Interestingly, in the data that we came across, Connecticut vastly underreports alcohol for newborns. By far, the highest drug found that children were born exposed to was marijuana. And this was before, our data only went up to 2021. So this was before Connecticut even legalized it. So, it was something like, thousands and thousands of newborns were born exposed to marijuana while in utero. It accounted for like 6% of total births during the study period. So there's a lot of stuff going on there. Secondly, and this is also fairly interesting, DCF can't investigate a parent just because of drug or alcohol use. It has to be in addition to something else, to other concerns. So, if someone is using heroin while pregnant, but otherwise has a great life, and this is kind of a this is a very this is kind of a far off argument, but otherwise has a great life. If they have a stable home and support systems and things like that, technically it doesn't warrant a DCF investigation. Just the heroin abuse while pregnant alone. So there has to be other mitigating factors. And what it comes down to is this is a very subjective uh, set of principles that doctors and medical staff at birthing hospitals are being asked to analyze. It's based on their best judgment, and they have to make that judgment kind of looking forward as to what is going to be best for this child moving forward. This has caused some parents to say that they have been unfairly investigated by DCF in the past. There was even a lawsuit filed against Hartford Healthcare by one mother who claims that she was investigated by DCF for having some drinking some wine on the weekends while she was pregnant, even though the child was perfectly fine and she was a fit mother and everything like that. The hospital staff notified the state, registered concerns, and launched an investigation into her. Another mother that I interviewed, she working professional down in Fairfield County area. She was giving birth to her second child, and it was what's called a precipitous birth, in that normally labor takes like 24 to 48 hours. She went into labor and 2 hours later had a baby. I mean, that is super fast. And she didn't know that was what was happening at the time. She was in a lot of pain. Her doctors, her doula, and an advisor was telling her not to come into the hospital. But because of the pain, she ended up taking an opioid pill that had been prescribed to her mother. So she took that pill. She ended up going to the hospital. She told everybody at the hospital that she took that pill. And everybody seemed fine with it. Baby was born perfectly healthy. 3 weeks later, she's got DCF knocking at her door and initiating a 45-day investigation where she has to go through drug screening. They interview her 5-year-old child. They interview her 5-year-old child's teachers. They interview everybody in the family, and it caused a lot of undue stress on her. In the piece, I compare her experience to another woman who we called Maria. She had used marijuana pretty regularly throughout her pregnancy. But once again, that alone can't be the basis of a DCF investigation. But she had a prior history. She was only 19 years old. It was her first child. She'd been in DCF care as an adolescent, so she was technically a victim in the DCF system. And then when she gives birth to her child, she gets a DCF investigation because not only her marijuana use, the fact that the father wasn't in the picture, and because of her history within DCF. So she ended up being investigated for 45 days. Notes indicated that she seemed to be doing pretty good as a mother, but at this point ended up losing her child anyway. After the father came back into the picture and was abusive. So there's a lot of fine lines around this issue. One of the things that I really found kind of fascinating was that, and there is an attorney, a woman named Carolyn Ryan. She is working with reaching out to these mothers and trying to help them understand what they're going through a little better, and even help them legally in some cases. But one of the points that she made in my interviews with her is that, all right, federal law says the child is born affected by drugs or alcohol. So, they're going through fetal withdrawal syndrome or fetal alcohol syndrome, what have you. In Connecticut, DCF does it as exposed to. So even if the child is born fine, if they were exposed at any point during the 9 months, they get a CAPA notification and, with a potential DCF investigation. But interestingly, Connecticut's statute says that when you actually read what requires a CAPA notification, it really seems to say that the child has to be born affected by the drugs or alcohol. It lists a child, showing symptoms of. So it's not in state statute, it doesn't indicate that any exposure whatsoever, even if the child is fine, warrants a CAPTA notification. Instead, it really leans on the affected by side. I interviewed a UConn professor for this. She said one of the reasons that Connecticut uses the exposed to definition is that it can be difficult to tell when a child is born whether or not they are affected by whatever drugs or alcohol the mother may have been using. It's a lot of it's based on how hard the baby's crying, how much they're screaming, things like that. So it can also be subjective. So they decided to make it, any exposure. So it depends on how you look at it, whether or not this is a net positive. I think it could be alarming for some mothers because, having, I have 4 kids myself, been down the pregnancy road with my ex-wife a number of times, and an occasional beer, glass of wine wasn't a big deal. Never seemed to be anyway, and I think a lot of people feel that way. But it could get you a notification, and if the doctors have any other concerns when you present, it could get you a DCF investigation. There are also concerns about whether or not this more greatly affects people who are living in poverty or minority mothers, because some of those other concerns could be, hey, these people don't have a lot of money, they don't have a lot of a great way to support this child, so that, in addition to the marijuana use, is a reason for a DCF investigation. So it was a lot of trying to split hairs in the investigation, and looking at the language and what does this language actually say, and then looking at some common sense things like, hey, should somebody who's using heroin during pregnancy be investigated? I mean, technically, according to DCF, no, but when you think about it in a common sense kind of way, it's like, well, maybe they should. So it really brings up a lot of different, issues and reactions, I think, when people actually read it.
For sure. Yeah, I mean, there's a ton of information in this investigation. I was curious as I looked through it too, because we live in a world of finite resources, right? Connecticut only has so much, DCF only has so much. There are so many hours in the day. So, the focus, high risk, is intended, it seems, to prioritize that which can actually be, mitigating the most damage. But on the other side of this, my understanding from reading your investigation was that the doctors and other medical professionals are mandated reporters. So you're kind of getting this inflated number of potential risk, and where there does seem to be an incentive to, at least at the top of that funnel, for who gets potentially investigated. That number grows because no one wants to be wrong. You don't want to miss something.
Yes, and this actually goes back a couple years to some legislation that was passed. And when I interviewed DCF, one of the people I spoke with pointed this out, is that doctors, and hospitals are going to much more likely err on the side of caution.
Right.
And one of the reasons for that is you can get in trouble if you don't report as a mandated reporter. Now, the guidelines around mandated reporters just changed this past session. So now the language says that if a mandated reporter either makes a report or doesn't make a report with the best intentions, that is so that they aren't held liable. So if basically they don't make a report and it's I can't remember what the exact language is, but out of that, they're making that in good faith.
Yeah.
They're not making that report in good faith, that they can't be held liable. So the DCF staff that I spoke to said, yeah, there probably is a very conservative bent in the hospitals towards reporting because of previous laws, but those laws are now being loosened to create a little bit more wiggle room. One of the more interesting things in just talking about this with the attorney Carolyn Ryan, is that her point was that DCF says that they're going to apply their standards and regulations when they receive a report, but she says the standards and regulations are that it's being made by medical personnel.
Yep.
On one hand, this makes sense to an average person like me, saying, well, yeah, if a doctor or a nurse has a concern, I would expect DCF to take that seriously. Her point, however, was that it puts the burden on the medical staff, that they are the standard by which DCF judges, so it's all on them, as opposed to DCF assuming the burden, which DCF can't be sued. You're putting it on people who can be sued and probably really want to play it safe. So she's really pushing for DCF to give clearer guidelines, spell out more clearly what statute says and what it is that they're looking for when it comes to these CAPTA notifications and when it comes to the actual investigations. DCF says that they are actually doing this. They are working with hospitals, and it's not just DCF. The Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services also participates in this because obviously there's addiction issues at play. So they conduct trainings with hospitals and try to keep them abreast of new changes in the laws and how to best implement these CAPTA notifications and when it's best to file a DCF report for investigation.
Like I said before, so much in this investigation. I want to spend like 3 hours on this. I don't know that that. Well, I don't know. Let me say this: read the investigation if you're watching or listening to this. And we have tried to do more engagement in the comments section on our website too. When people have questions, just clarifying things or getting more information or making referrals. This seems to be a huge gray area, but also evolving. So I'll expect that there will be more here in the future. I want to move on though to our second investigation to chat about. Brandon, you're here. I want to hear your voice. Sorry, we haven't gotten you in sooner. Where's Barry? This is the name of the investigation. It's a 30-year-old cold case. Bring us up to speed.
Absolutely. So this story, it kind of came to us through a tip. And this essentially Barry was a tugboat sailor. He was a Connecticut resident, father of four, and he disappeared off of his tugboat in December of 1990, and his family has been looking for him ever since. The last person to see him was his coworker, and he's since died, and he wasn't with Barry at the time of his disappearance. There were no witnesses who saw him exit the boat or fall into the water. And so the family has been kind of working with not a lot of leads to go on. At the time they involved the New York Police Department, Harbor Police Department, the Coast Guard. They hired their own private investigators. They hired divers to dive in the area. I mean, the family themselves, Barry was one of 8 siblings. So a bunch of them came down as well as some family friends, and they kind of went on a search themselves, and they posted flyers everywhere. And eventually, the police had ruled that, well, since nothing had come up in the morgues or, we didn't have any records of him at the hospitals, then the most likely thing was he probably just fell in the water and drowned. And the Coast Guard, they had ruled that since, well, there was, no witnesses to him falling in the water, nobody heard any splashing, there was no signs of it above board, and he had told his crewmate, the last person who had seen him, that he was going to leave to wish his daughter a happy birthday because unfortunately the day of his disappearance was the day of one of his daughter's birthdays. they had presumed that, well, we'd find it unlikely that he fell into the water. So, not even the authorities could kind of agree upon what happened to him. And so it's been really just it's interesting seeing how families kind of go about navigating these cases, especially after it's been so long. I mean, it only makes things more difficult. I spoke with Connecticut cold case units. I believe, what was his title? It was like supervisory investigator, Michael Sheldon. And he's been with the unit since it was formed. So that's going on over 20 years now, I think close to 25 years now. And I also spoke with James Adcock, who used to be a forensic, I don't know how you would want to frame it. He worked in a morgue and he would help the police, a forensic body investigator, I suppose.
Interesting.
And yeah, and then he started his own private investigation organization, and it is based now in Memphis. So he helps out with training the Memphis Police Department. He helps also when they're, really stumped on cases, he helps them investigate murders. So he's a guy who has a lot of experience in kind of helping families through cold cases. And both of them, I mean, there's basically you're very limited at this point. I mean, they both kind of noted the fact that, well, even the investigators who worked on the case, like there was several private investigators that the family hired. They're dead. Barry's crewmate has since died, and there was no video anywhere. There was no cameras anywhere. I mean, James Adcock, who's the private investigator, he had noted that he imagines things have changed a lot as far as investigation practices go with missing persons. It was noted one of the things that makes the story interesting was there was kind of some suspicious circumstances the family thought surrounding Barry's disappearance. One of them being that the company that Barry had worked for had sent over to Barry's wife about a week or two after his disappearance, the clothes that he was believed to be wearing at the time that he was missing. And the private investigator said, that kind of stuff would never happen now. Police will take everything, they'll investigate every single belonging and kind of lock it away from families. Whereas at the time, a couple days after, the family was kind of pounding to get on the boat so they could take his belongings and kind of, say that's that. And so it's very different now how things are investigated. And it's also just so much more difficult when this much time has passed because so many of your leads have kind of dried up. And so we really were able to dig into the files that they have and kind of see what they're working with. And it is a ton of information, but you also do kind of get a sense of the limitations. I know the family is also frustrated as well with the fact that they can't really secure case files as far as from the police department that had investigated the NYPD precinct that had kind of investigated his original disappearance. And also speaking with the investigators, it's actually a pretty common occurrence. Apparently, you have to foil for them, but it's very easy for those foils to get denied. The private investigator, he said that in his experience, it works best when the next of kin is the one to do the foil. But beyond that, if you keep getting denied, then essentially you have no other option but to go before a judge. And obviously that's timely, it's costly. And on the flip side of things, Sheldon, who is a police officer, he kind of gave some really good reasoning that I think, at least when I was going into it, I was curious to hear what he had to say because I was wondering, if these cases are cold, very likely they haven't been meaningfully looked at or worked in however many years. Like what's kind of the harm in giving it to these families? And he had said basically, if you give these cases over to families and they start spreading that information, then you kind of lose leverage as to finding whatever criminal may have been involved. he had cited one case where he was working on a murder and there was reporting on it. However, they had missed this one detail. And so he used this one detail in the course of interrogating a guy to know that, okay, this man, he must be the killer because I know that this was not public information. And he told me it and it was accurate. And so essentially, if a family does kind of get case files and they start making it public, then the police kind of lose that edge. Of course, it is a battle, because it's like I do understand that perspective, but also I understand the perspective of families, and I do think it's like if if you haven't looked at it in a certain amount of time and there's not much to go off of, then I do understand. I think a lot of the times you could probably get off scotch-free giving those files away. Of course, unless you lost the files, which is another possibility that was proposed by the private investigator that he had seen. So it was really interesting just seeing everything that they have from an information standpoint, seeing all the limitations that are often kind of involved at looking in cases like these, not only through the eyes of the family, but also through people who investigate this stuff for a living. But then kind of really the most tragic and kind of the hardest part about putting the whole story together was just looking at the impact that these kind of unresolved mysteries will have on families. Um, I don't think I included it in the article because there was a lot I couldn't include in the article, despite the fact that it's like 10,000 words. There was just so much to the story that I thought was super interesting and powerful, but it's like you can only fit so much. I do think we did a good job at distilling it to the most important parts. But Adcock, the private investigator, I had asked him, I was like, how have you seen these unsolved cases kind of impact families? And he was he was almost pissed off by me asking the question. He's like, what do you think? He's like, they're impacted horribly. He said they lose kind of their faith in society as a whole. They lose faith in the police and they lose faith in the ability of kind of just these services that we take for granted as, oh, they'll protect us, or family members that we take for granted as, oh, they'll be here or they'll die of natural causes. And it kind of warps people's worldviews and towards a more pessimistic way. And I think we definitely kind of saw that. I kind of got a bit of that, speaking with Kathy, which was one of Barry's seven seven siblings. I don't mean to say that she's pessimistic now. I think actually this family, everything that they've been through, they do a really good job of keeping themselves in good spirits, and they're ever the optimists, and they're very hopeful, and they're very just persistent and maintain that they'll keep fighting, which I think speaking with the people who investigate these things for a living, speaking with Sheldon, speaking with Adcock, both of them say that that's the most important thing to be if you're unfortunately a family member in this situation. But as positive as you can be, it'll catch up to you. Kathy had said, she's a very religious woman. She works at a Catholic school. She was raised Catholic, went to church every Sunday. She was like, there's times where, this has really made me question my faith, made me question my belief in God. And you just wonder why, why did this happen? Why did this happen to the man it happened to? Why do we still have no answers? And she said it's been kind of hard, but you battle through it. But it's also hard when you like where the story is now, where Jenna, which is Barry's niece, she's the one who's really been kind of cranking things back into full gear, and the other family members are supportive of that. But Kathy did note that, you try and forget about it for a while, but then you kind of get motivated to work on it. And every time that happens, or someone gets motivated to work on it, you just know it's going to dredge up those old feelings. And as for the kind of the most immediate, well, both immediate impact and long-term impact, immediately after Barry went missing, his wife at the time, it was his second wife, Sandy, she's kind of really just took a downward spiral. She was hospitalized for a mental break. She fell into drug addiction, and her kids, so Barry had four kids. There was two with a previous marriage, but they were still close to Barry. His ex-wife still had an amicable relationship, and they were still close as well. And then there was two with his second wife. One of them being Jody, and Jody actually was not his biological kid, but he took her in and raised her as one. Ashley was a kid that he and Sandy had, and they Jody's doing well now. She's a nurse. She's married. Ashley, not so much. She has kind of just for the better part of a decade, maybe even a little bit longer, has kind of just been in and out of jail, battling addiction. And so you kind of see just the impact that it has, generationally. I mean, the father going missing, that impacted the mother, that impacted, her daughters, and even the daughters from the first marriage, which is Trish and Maureen. I mean, Barry was their father, and they had stepdads afterwards, and it really just it's not uncommon for, kids to be a little standoffish with step parents, but from what I've, gathered, this really kind of poisoned the well with their stepfathers. Um, and it also kind of just Trish, she was very, very kind of honest, really. Um, just speaking about how it's really impacted her relationship with men overall. She said that she would kind of get into relationships with older men when she shouldn't have. She would cling on to her friends' fathers. She had kids very young. And she said that kind of just she was always looking for another man to kind of give her the unconditional love that she had kind of been missing since her father went gone. And so that, you see kind of how that's impacted her life. I mean, I believe she has four children now. And, she's doing well, but you could tell that just it's one of those experiences where it doesn't really leave you and it impacts everyone in different ways, but a lot of most of those impacts are definitely very negative. So it's a sad story. It's an interesting story. It's kind of a bit of an eye-opening story. One of the things that really jumped out to me as well, as far as eye-opening, was kind of just the amorphous nature of how, missing persons cases, the data is collected. It's very kind of difficult to really get a full grasp as to how many of these cases go unsolved. As of right now, we're going off of the best estimates. It's apparently a very low number, but it's really just difficult to quantify because there's two major databases, which is NCIC, maybe there's a second I in there, the National Criminal Institute. I don't recall, but there's NCIC and then there's NamUs, and NCIC is federally kind of every missing person, no matter where you are in all 50 states, that must be reported to the NCIC. And so you're like, great, this has got to be the leading database for figuring things out, but they don't itemize any of their data. They don't release any of these reports. NamUs, you can kind of, if you know somebody who's missing, if they're in NamUs, you can look their name up, boom, see everything you need. NCIC, it's not like that. And also both databases, they have the issue of where essentially they look at the amount of cases closed per year, they look at the amount opened per year, but they don't kind of itemize it year by year. So you don't know, if this case closed this year was from 30 years ago or if it was just one that happened this year. So it's very difficult kind of to get a grasp of the data end of things. But all in all, there was a lot to this story. We could talk about it for hours. So if that's yeah, if you haven't read it, I beg that you please do. I'm sure, not only would I appreciate it, but I think the family would appreciate it as well. So yeah.
I mean, it was emotional. truly to read through, and I commend you for taking the time to dig into that human element. The first section alone, just getting into the details, probably could have been an investigation on its own, and taking the time to do it right and understand that long-term impact, bring it into today. I really appreciated it about the work. We are going to head toward wrapping up here for time constraints, but thank you both for the work that you're doing. Thank you for both these pieces. We have two more coming up shortly from both of you, so I'm excited about that. Keep an eye. Sundays, new investigations dropping. To everyone watching, listening, and tuning in, thank you for your support. We will be back in 2 weeks. Until then, be well, stay safe, and stay informed.